Welcome, everybody, to History Analyzed. I'm your host, Mark Palmer. This is a podcast which examines historical events and issues. The events we're analyzing today are the life of Anne Frank, the Wannsee Conference, and the Holocaust. You may not have heard of the Wannsee Conference. That was a clandestine meeting of Nazi leaders during World War II to outline the systematic murder of Jews in Europe, which became known as the Holocaust. If you've never heard of Anne Frank, she is one of the most widely read authors in history, although she did not live to see the publication of her book. She was a German teenager who happened to be Jewish as well. She and her family were swept up in the horrors of the Holocaust, and by that term, we mean the program of Adolf Hitler during World War II to commit genocide of all of the Jews that were within the reach of Nazi authority. The diary Anne Frank kept during her family's period of hiding from the Nazis is both fascinating and painful to read, but it is a must-read. I'm a baby boomer, and for me, and most of my generation around the globe, World War II still seems very real, even though we were born well after the war. Many of our fathers, including my own, fought in World War II. That gives us a tangible connection. But for most people throughout the planet, World War II is just something from the history books. The horrors from that time have become abstract. Joseph Stalin was the ruthless dictator of the Soviet Union from the late 1920s through the early 1950s. There is a quote that is attributed to him that says, "The death of one man is a tragedy. The death of millions is a statistic." Although it sounds like something he would say, I've never been able to find any evidence that he actually said it. The reason I bring up this quote is because I think we've become desensitized to some of the enormous tragedies from history. I think the Holocaust falls into that category. If you ask most people what happened in the Holocaust, they will tell you that millions of Jews were murdered by the Nazis. Many people can tell you that the horrendous number is approximately 6 million slaughtered. The problem with a crime on such a scale is that you lose track of the humanity. People forget that these were individuals like us. They had normal, everyday lives, dealing with family, friends, jobs, worrying about caring for elderly parents or little kids, having arguments with their significant others, and all of the other aspects of daily life. These were people, not just statistics. To me, that's the best thing about reading the diary of Anne Frank. I first read it in middle school when I did not properly appreciate it. I reread it a few months ago, and it's fabulous. It chronicles the 2 years her family hid out in part of a building in Amsterdam during the occupation of the Netherlands by the Nazis. The reason it is so wonderful is because most of it deals with the things on the mind of a teenage girl. There are times she's not getting along with her mother. She describes the crush she has on a boy whose family is also in hiding with Anne's family. She dreams about what she would like to be when she grows up after the war. But she also describes what life was like to be in hiding from the Gestapo. I would certainly recommend for everybody to read the diary of Anne Frank because it does remind us that these 6 million people murdered in the Holocaust were not just numbers, but actual individuals like us. Here are some of the terms I will be referencing in this episode that you may or may not be familiar with. The Wehrmacht was the German army. The Red Army was the army of the Soviet Union. The Gestapo was the official secret police of Nazi Germany. The SA stood for the Sturmabteilung. That literally translates to assault division, but essentially in English it means storm division or stormtroopers. If you have ever seen any video or photo of Nazi Germany, you've seen those fanatics wearing the brown shirts with the Nazi armbands. They were Hitler's private army as he was rising to power. I do not speak German, so please excuse these pronunciations. The SS stood for Schutzstaffel, meaning protection squads. That's because the SS started out as the personal guards for Adolf Hitler. But Heimlich Himmler grew the SS into an enormous operation which had a very large effect in Germany and the conquered territories. The SS was tasked with eliminating all opposition to the Third Reich. In 1939, the Gestapo became part of the SS. The Hitler Youth were males under the age of 18. It was a youth group to indoctrinate young males into Nazi ideology. Throughout this episode, I sometimes say Auschwitz-Birkenau and sometimes simply Auschwitz. Birkenau was a subdivision of the enormous Auschwitz concentration camp. Birkenau was the primary extermination center where most of the victims at Auschwitz were murdered. I will explain about the Wannsee Conference in a little bit and tie all of this into the Holocaust. But first, let's talk about Anne Frank and her family. Anne was born on June 12, 1929, in Frankfurt am Main, Germany, into a middle-class German family. Her father's name was Otto. He was born and raised in Germany. After high school, he attended the University of Heidelberg. He then went to New York City, where he worked at a bank and even Macy's department store. In 1909, when his father died, Otto returned to Germany. In World War I, he served in the German army. He did so well that he was promoted to lieutenant and was decorated. Think about that. He was a loyal German citizen and even served his country. Yet this counted for nothing when it came to sending Otto and his family to concentration camps. After World War I, Otto worked in the family's banking business. When he was 36 years old, he married Edith Hollander in Frankfurt am Main. They had two daughters. Margot was born on February 16, 1926, and Anne was born 3 years later. Edith was a stay-at-home mom who took care of her family. The Franks were happy living in Germany. And why not? They were Germans just like everybody else. Well, until January 1933, that's when the Nazis came into power. Otto clearly saw what the Nazis were doing and where this would lead. Otto moved his family to the Netherlands. This seemed like a very good option. The Dutch were very welcoming to refugees, and Amsterdam seemed like a wonderful place to live. I don't know if Otto was thinking ahead about a possible war, but if he was, I'm sure that he remembered that in World War I, the Netherlands was able to remain neutral and was not invaded by the Germans on their way to France. Soon after arriving in Amsterdam, Otto became the managing director of the Netherlands branch of a German company called Opekta. The company made a gelling agent used for making homemade jam. This episode focuses on the Holocaust of the Jews. But the Nazis also murdered Roma, gay people, persons with mental health issues, people with certain genetic problems or diseases, Soviet prisoners of war, and anybody else that they did not like. Some people think that when Hitler and the Nazis took over, they immediately started murdering all the Jews. Not so. Fascists have to ease into their repression. They have to make the general population get used to certain ideas so they will accept their heinous programs. It's like a snowball rolling downhill. It starts off small and gets bigger and bigger. When the Nazis took over, there was already a lot of anti-Semitism in Germany. And although we are focusing on the Third Reich in this episode, there was certainly anti-Semitism in other countries as well. But Hitler and the Nazis understood that they needed to have the population go along with all of their insane plans. That's why Joseph Goebbels was so important. He was Hitler's propaganda minister, and unfortunately for the world, he was brilliant at what he did. The talents of Joseph Goebbels allowed Hitler to achieve so many of his deranged goals. Here's an example. The Nazis started World War II by invading Poland on September 1, 1939. And I can hear some of you out there screaming at me that World War II started in China in 1937. But that was a large war that was limited to Asia. What turned it into a world war was the invasion of Poland. The Nazis claimed the Poles started it. They performed this whole charade called Operation Himmler. Prior to the invasion on September 1, Hitler was claiming that the Poles were brutalizing or even killing ethnic Germans living in Poland. Then, on August 31, 1939, German troops dressed in Polish uniforms attacked places along the German side of the border with Poland. The most famous incident was when a group of German operatives stormed a local radio station and broadcast an anti-German message in Polish. They left some dead bodies dressed in Polish uniforms. The dead bodies were prisoners from concentration camps. They took photos and used this farce as proof that the Poles had attacked Germany first. When I was in high school, I did not understand this. Why did Hitler need to convince the German people that they should go to war with Poland? He was an absolute tyrant and could do whatever he wanted. That was true, but only to a point. It's much better to have the populace with you even when you are a dictator. It's more effective to have people believing in what they're doing rather than just following orders out of fear of the consequences if they disobey. This is why Germany, a country of only 70 million people with limited resources, did so well when they took on most of the world. I do not say this with admiration. I'm just pointing out that they believed in their cause. The same was true regarding the systematic program against the Jews. The Nazis did not announce in the early part of 1933 that they wanted to murder all of the Jews in Germany and any other place that they might conquer. They eased into it. They got the non-Jewish population of Germany kind of used to this discrimination, which got worse and worse over the years. They began slowly. Starting in April of 1933, the government told people throughout Germany to boycott Jewish businesses. To a lot of Germans at the time, this didn't seem so bad. At least it wasn't happening to them. Also, in April of 1933, there was the new Laws for Reestablishment of the Civil Service. These regulations barred Jews from holding civil service, university, and state positions. On May 10, 1933, there was an event that you've certainly seen in photos and videos: the public burning of books that were written by Jews, political dissidents, or anybody that was not approved by the Nazis. Banning books was a key step to get the populace to follow Nazi ideology. In July of 1933, the Nazis issued the Law on the Revocation of Naturalizations and the Revocation of German Citizenship. This law allowed the government to revoke the citizenship of anybody naturalized between November 1918, which was the end of World War I, and January 30, 1933, when Hitler became Chancellor. Although it was broadly stated, the law was targeted at Eastern European Jews who had moved to Germany and had become German citizens. The Nazis enacted the infamous Nuremberg Laws in September 1935. They were called the Nuremberg Laws because these appalling statutes were passed during a special session of the Reichstag, the German parliament, during the annual Nuremberg rally of the Nazi Party. There were two acts passed as the Nuremberg Laws. Number one, the Reich Citizenship Law, and number two, the Law for the Protection of German Blood and German Honor. Essentially, these laws codified the depraved feelings of the Nazis that Jews in Germany were somehow different and therefore not really citizens. It didn't matter if a person was born and raised in Germany and their family had lived in Germany for generations. Only members of the supposed Aryan race were true Germans. Aryans were a mythical, superior master race which mainly meant one of pure German or Nordic blood. The Nazis had been professing this absurdity of Jews being an inferior race for years. Now they had enacted laws which said as much. The Nuremberg laws set out definitions defining who was considered Jewish. As a result, German Jews were forbidden to marry Aryan Germans or to even have sex with non-Jewish Germans. Further, Jews were no longer considered citizens of the Third Reich. This meant they no longer had any rights as a German citizen. In November 1935, the Nazis wanted to make it clear as to who qualified as a Jew under their racist policies. German law now defined anyone with 3 Jewish grandparents as Jewish, or somebody with 2 Jewish grandparents who identified as Jewish. Jewish doctors were barred from practicing medicine in any German institutions. Beginning in April 1938, all property or assets exceeding 5,000 Reichsmarks, that was the name of the German currency, held by Jews in Germany had to be registered with the government. If you were going to confiscate people's property, you had to know what they owned so you could seize it. As you can see, the persecution was steadily increasing. They were getting the German population used to legalized discrimination. The Nazis really ratcheted up the anti-Semitism to widespread violence with an event known as Kristallnacht. That essentially translates to Night of Broken Glass. The Nazis liked to present a purported reason for doing what they were doing. They finally decided they got their supposed excuse on November 7, 1938, when a Polish Jewish refugee named Herschel Grinspan shot and killed Ernst von Rath, a German diplomatic official in Paris. Theoretically in response, on the night of November 9, 1938, the Nazis coordinated a wave of anti-Semitic violence throughout Germany. It was supposed to look like a spontaneous outburst of anger against the Jews, but in reality, it was state-sponsored violence, vandalism, and arson. Nazi leaders instructed the SS, the SA, and the Hitler Youth to attack Jewish communities throughout the country on the night of November 9. The violence carried on throughout the night and into the next morning. Hundreds, perhaps as many as 1,400 synagogues were set on fire. Thousands of Jewish-owned businesses were destroyed. The thugs broke into and severely vandalized Jewish homes. Jewish cemeteries were desecrated, and individual people were beaten by the rioters purely for being Jewish. Since this was state-sponsored terrorism, the police did not help the victims, and the fire departments did not put out the fires. I cannot find any accurate figures as to how many people were killed during Kristallnacht. I've seen estimates of around 100 to several hundred. One number that I have found in several sources is that approximately 30,000 Jewish men were arrested by the police and the SS. How crazy is that? Mobs are destroying their homes and businesses and terrorizing these poor people, and the authorities arrest the victims. Most were sent to concentration camps. Besides a turning point in the organized violence against the Jews of Germany, this was also the first instance of mass arrests of Jews simply for being Jewish. We don't have accurate figures, but many of the people who were incarcerated were later released on the promise that they would immediately leave Germany and leave most of their assets behind. On November 12, 1938, Hermann Goering announced some economic punishments after Kristallnacht. Jews were fined 1 billion Reichsmarks to pay for the damage. Jews were also responsible for paying for and repairing the damage caused during the riots, and any insurance coverage was to be paid directly to the German government. This was by no means the cruelest thing that the Nazis ever did to the Jews of Germany, but it might have been the most ludicrous. The national government organized a wave of violence and destruction wherein Jewish homes and businesses were vandalized. And then they charged the victims of these crimes for the damages which occurred to the property of the victims. The Nazis liked appearing to do things legally. So, on November 12, 1938, the Nazi government issued the Decree on the Elimination of Jews from German Economic Life, forcing all Jews to transfer retail businesses to so-called Aryan Germans. 3 days later, on November 15, 1938, all Jewish pupils were expelled from German schools. Jews were being pushed to emigrate from Germany, and a lot of them left. Between 1933 and the start of World War II in 1939, approximately 300,000 Jews left Germany. This left a little over 200,000 Jews still living in Germany. Some people question, why didn't they all leave? First of all, I hate when people blame the victims. There are people who take the position that it was their fault. They could see what the Nazis were doing. They were fools to stay. Okay, a couple of points in rebuttal. Number one, it was their homeland. As you listen to this episode, think about times when you thought the government of your country was very wrong, unfair, or unjust, but you probably didn't leave because it was your home. Remember, these people were Germans. They just happened to also be Jewish. Number two, a lot of these people couldn't leave Germany for several reasons. Reason A, they couldn't afford to go. What would you do in that situation? The Nazis seized all of your assets. You've lost your job. You have no money. How do you move your family to another country? Reason B, some had no place to go. A lot of countries were not welcoming these refugees with open arms. I hate to say it, but the United States was one of those countries. A lot of that had to do with the Immigration Act of 1924. That American law had two primary provisions. Number one, the 1924 law capped total immigration to the United States per year at 165,000. This greatly cut down on the total number of immigrants. Number two, the new law was also designed to allow entry for immigrants from the right kind of countries and reduce or exclude people from countries that were considered undesirable. Regrettably, that law did what it was intended to do. The people in support of the Immigration Act of 1924 said that they wanted to reduce the number of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. This mainly meant the Italians and Eastern European Jews who were coming to America in such alarming numbers. In the years leading up to World War I, approximately 35% of all immigrants to the U.S. were coming from Italy and Russia. That's when my grandparents came to the U.S. from Italy. The people coming from Russia were Jews escaping the pogroms, meaning the killing and persecution of the Jews. So they came up with this idea of a quota system. The new law would limit the number of people emigrating to the U.S. to 2% of the people from that particular country who were living in the United States in 1890. The feeling was that in the 1890 census, the United States was not overrun by Jews, Italians, or other nationalities considered undesirable. This quota system was racist and discriminatory, and it rose to tragic status in the 1930s when European Jews were trying to escape the Nazis but couldn't enter the U.S. because they could not get American visas. The most infamous of these incidents involved a ship called the St. Louis. That was a German ocean liner which left Hamburg, Germany on May 13, 1939. This was less than 4 months before World War II erupted in Europe. Almost all of the 937 passengers on the St. Louis were Jewish refugees fleeing the cruelty of the Third Reich. The ship was originally bound for Havana, but when they arrived there, the Cuban government had canceled their landing permits. The St. Louis then sailed for the U.S., but the American government refused to accept the passengers because they did not have U.S. immigration visas. By 1939, Germany had already annexed Austria. The 1939 immigration quota for the combined Germany and Austria was 27,370. That quota had already been filled for the year. Under the existing laws, visas could only be granted to the passengers of the St. Louis by denying visas to some of the many thousand German and Austrian Jews who were already on a waiting list. Certainly, under these circumstances, the U.S. should have made an exception. The brutal racial policies against the Jews in the Third Reich were already known outside of Germany. But the American government refused to break its own quota law, even though these were extreme circumstances which were literally life and death. So the St. Louis returned to Western Europe, but not to Germany. Britain, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands each admitted some of the passengers. The ones in the UK remained safe from the Nazis, but the German war machine overran France, Belgium, and the Netherlands in May and June of 1940. Some of the passengers from the St. Louis had already gotten out of those countries, but 532 St. Louis passengers were caught by the Nazis. Around half of those survived the war, but tragically, 254 passengers from the St. Louis were killed in the Holocaust. As I just mentioned, in May and June of 1940, the Nazis conquered France, along with the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. This meant that by the late spring of 1940, Anne Frank and her family were now living in an occupied country. Otto Frank made efforts to get his family out of Europe and to the United States. But as I explained earlier, the U.S. was enforcing its quota system on immigration and was not helping the Jews who were trying to flee from Nazi persecution. The U.K. was not an option at this point because the British were at war with Nazi Germany, so there was no direct transportation between Nazi-occupied countries and Britain. The Nazis started implementing laws against the Jews living in the Netherlands. In late 1940, all Jewish-owned or operated businesses were required to register with the Nazi authorities. In January 1941, all residents with Jewish ancestry had to register as Jews. Starting in May 1942, all Jews in the Netherlands were required to wear a yellow Star of David on their outer clothing so they could be easily identified. Jews in the Netherlands were prohibited from attending the same schools as non-Jews and could not shop in certain stores. They were also banned from many public facilities like parks, zoos, theaters, and restaurants. On June 12, 1942, Anne Frank turned 13 years old. Her father took her to one of the bookstores in Amsterdam where Jews were still permitted to shop so she could pick out a birthday present. She selected a beautiful book with blank pages which she could use as a diary. She soon started writing her thoughts in her new journal. She wrote her entries like they were letters to an imaginary friend named Kitty. Otto Frank was always thinking ahead. He saw what was happening to the Jews in the Netherlands. Since he could not get his family out of the Netherlands, he did the next best thing. In 1942, he set up a hiding place. It was an empty part of the building where Otto's business, Opekta, was operating. They used a large bookcase to cover the entrance to a stairway that led to an empty space upstairs. In her diary, Anne named the space the Secret Annex, and that title has stuck. The Franks had to stock this hiding place with all of the necessities of life, but they had to do so slowly to avoid the Gestapo from discovering what they were doing. The hideaway was not quite ready by July, but Margot received a call-up notice on July 5, 1942, to report for labor duty in Germany. The Frank family understood that, at best, This meant that Margot would be used as slave labor. At worst, she would be murdered. So on July 6, 1942, the Frank family moved into the secret annex at Prinsengracht 263 in Amsterdam. This was less than a month after Anne started her diary. Otto's employee, Herman van Pels, along with his wife, Auguste, and son, Peter, moved in 1 week later since they were also Jewish. That was a total of 7 people in the secret annex. In November 1942, an 8th person moved in. That was Fritz Pfeffer. He was a dentist who was originally from Germany and had been seeking refuge in Amsterdam. These 8 lived in the secret annex until the summer of 1944. How did Anne Frank and the others survive in the secret annex for 2 years? There were 6 Dutch people who were willing to risk their lives to help them. I don't speak Dutch, so please forgive my pronunciation of these names. The 6 Dutch helpers were Victor Kugler, Johannes Kleinman, Johan Vascuil, and his daughter Bep Vascuil, Miep Gijs, and her husband Jan Gijs. Except for Jan Gijs, they all worked for Otto Frank at Opekta. These courageous people brought food and all of the other necessities of life to the 8 people in the secret annex. The Holocaust can only be viewed as an industrial program of murder. There have been a lot of anti-Semitic agendas throughout history, most notably the pogroms in Russia. In case you're not familiar with that term, a pogrom was organized violent attacks on Jews in Russia. In a 4-year period from 1918 through 1921, more than 100,000 Jews were murdered in pogroms in Russia. Of course, I'm not diminishing such atrocities, but the Holocaust by Nazi Germany during World War II was on an entirely different magnitude. This wasn't just destruction and killing on a haphazard basis. This was the most organized system of murder ever. Earlier, I outlined how the Nazis started persecuting the Jews in Germany in the spring of 1933, and as time progressed, the persecution became more and more serious and deadly. When I was outlining that progression, I stopped just before World War II. That's because the war granted Hitler and his malevolent cronies the opportunity to go much, much further. In September 1939, the poor people of Poland did not stand a chance because Hitler and Joseph Stalin had made a secret deal to divide the country. As a result, Poland ceased to exist as an independent country. There were a lot of horrendous things that the Nazis wanted to do to the Jews, but not necessarily in front of the general German public. Occupying half of Poland as conquered territory allowed a kind of secret place to commit these terrible deeds. And because of the war, the world had trouble learning what the Nazis were doing. The Nazis established ghettos in Poland and other occupied territories. In case you're not familiar with that term, a ghetto was an enclosed area in a city where the Nazis forced Jews to live in terrible conditions, segregated from the rest of the population and unable to leave. This was the first step in the Holocaust, rounding up Jewish people into locations where the Nazis could easily get to them when they decided to exterminate them. And I know exterminate is a harsh word, but that's what the Nazis were trying to do: annihilate millions of people because they viewed them as different. Many people living in these ghettos were forced to work as slave labor for the German war effort. A lot of people in these ghettos died from starvation, overwork, or diseases brought on by malnutrition. This is one of the many instances demonstrating the warped priorities of the Nazis. If you were at war and facing labor shortages, and you were relying on slave labor, you would want to keep your slave labor force healthy and productive. And of course, I'm not excusing slave labor. But the Nazis thought it was preferable to just work these people to death, even if it caused labor scarcities, resulting in consequences on the battlefields. By the fall of 1940, The Warsaw Ghetto contained approximately 400,000 or more people. In 1941, World War II greatly expanded by two events. The first occurred on June 22, 1941, in Operation Barbarossa. That was when Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union. It was the largest invasion in the history of the world. The Germans and their allies had over 3 million men invade the USSR. 6 months later, on December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the Japanese launched a surprise attack on the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. This enormous expansion of the war in 1941 provided cover for the Nazis to carry out the Holocaust. And now it's time to talk about the Wannsee Conference. This was a meeting held on January 20, 1942, at a villa in the Berlin suburb of Wannsee. That's spelled Wannnsee, but the Germans pronounced it as Wannsee, not Wannsee. 15 high-ranking Nazi party and military officials came together to discuss the so-called final solution to the Jewish question. They always presented it like it was a problem that needed solving. What were they going to do about the Jews? It never occurred to them to leave them alone. The top tier of Nazis, Hitler, Goering, Himmler, and Goebbels, were not at the Wannsee Conference, but they were represented at this meeting. The timing of this meeting is very significant because it demonstrates the twisted priorities of the Third Reich. A few months earlier, things looked very good for Nazi Germany in the fall of 1941. Britain was barely hanging on because of the U-boat menace starving the UK of food and supplies. The Wehrmacht, the German army at that point, had killed, wounded, or captured somewhere between 4.3 and 6 million soldiers of the Red Army. I've read various estimates. The Wehrmacht was closing in on Moscow and had Leningrad surrounded. It looked like Germany had a good chance to win the war. But by late January 1942, things had radically changed. The German offensives ground to a complete stop in the Soviet Union due to the brutal weather and the Red Army counterattacking. The Wehrmacht had failed to take Moscow or Leningrad, although Leningrad was completely surrounded and was under siege at this point. More important, the United States was in the war. I'm not saying this because I'm an American, but I did an episode explaining how the incredible industrial output of the United States was the biggest factor in the Allies winning the war. Any rational observer in January of 1942 would certainly think that the Allies were likely to win the war. And even if you believe that the Axis powers could still win, it would be obvious that they would need to marshal all of their resources since they were greatly outnumbered in men and the materials of war. Instead, at the Wannsee Conference, the Nazi leaders outlined their program to commit mass murder on an unprecedented scale. This would be a giant undertaking that would tie up a lot of the limited resources of Nazi Germany. The chairman of the Wannsee Conference was SS General Reinhard Heydrich. He was the chief of the Reich Security Main Office and one of the top deputies of the head of the SS, Heinrich Himmler. The assistant for Heydrich was SS Lieutenant Colonel Adolf Eichmann, chief of the Reich Security Main Office for Jewish Affairs. Eichmann prepared the minutes of the meeting. After the January 1942 meeting, 30 copies of the Wannsee Protocol were distributed to the attendees and other high-ranking officials. They were told to destroy these minutes after they reviewed them. However, Martin Luther, and no, not that Martin Luther, kept his copy of the minutes. Martin Luther was at the Wannsee meeting because he was Under Secretary of State. His copy of the minutes of the Wannsee Conference was the only one to survive the war. After the war, high-ranking Nazis were put on trial in Nuremberg, Germany. At the Nuremberg trials, documentary and other physical evidence, as well as testimonial evidence, created a lasting record of the atrocities of the Third Reich. Martin Luther's copy of the minutes from the Wannsee Conference was entered into evidence at the Nuremberg trials. Before that, very few people had even heard of the Wannsee Conference. This was how the world learned what occurred there. Martin Luther himself was not at the Nuremberg trials because he had already died. In 1943, Martin Luther was sent to the Sachsenhausen concentration camp after supposedly conspiring against his boss, Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop. He was still at Sachsenhausen when that camp was liberated by the Red Army, but died shortly thereafter. I know that we should not make light of somebody being sent to a concentration camp, but how can we fail to appreciate the irony of one of the 15 members of the Wannsee Conference ending up in a concentration camp himself? Here is a summary of what evil was discussed at that meeting on January 20, 1942, in that beautiful villa in Wannsee. The purpose of the Wannsee Conference was not to discuss whether the Jews should be murdered. The purpose of the meeting was to inform the attendees of how this final solution would be carried out, and to inform these men that this program was ordered from Hitler himself and that Reinhard Heydrich would be running this grotesque operation. At some point in 1941, Hitler had decided that it was finally time to murder all of the Jews that he could reach. In the second half of 1941, Einsatzgruppen had commenced mass murder of Jews in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. The Einsatzgruppen were special paramilitary death squads from the SS. The murders were conducted on a haphazard basis. Mostly, they were just having the victims dig giant pits and then shoot these oppressed people and bury them in those pits. They were also using some gas fans. The people to be murdered were placed into a van which had the exhaust fumes funneled back into the back of the van to asphyxiate everybody inside. At the Wannsee Conference, Reinhard Heydrich explained to the other people in attendance the problems with these methods of homicide. Shooting people, especially women and children, was bad for the morale of the SS soldiers who were doing the killing. I've always found this so reprehensible. These Nazi leaders didn't think twice about trying to annihilate an entire group of people, but they were sensitive to the feelings of their soldiers who had to commit the executions. The gas fans were considered a good start, but they couldn't kill people fast enough. As Heydrich explained to the other attendees at the Wannsee Conference, if the Germans were successful in defeating the Soviet Union, it was estimated that there would be 11 million Jews under the control of Hitler. They needed a method to murder 11 million people as quickly and efficiently as possible. The solution, as General Heydrich explained, was to have death camps where people could be gassed on an industrial basis. There were many German concentration camps, and some operated differently. The largest and most infamous camp was Auschwitz-Birkenau, so we'll talk specifically about it. Upon arrival, people would be split into two groups, one for slave labor and the other group for immediate murder. Although it was not close to being one of the worst things that the Nazis did to concentration camp prisoners, I've always hated their mocking slogan over the front gate at Auschwitz and several other camps. In metal letters over the main gate, there was the phrase, "Arbeit macht frei." In English, that means work makes you free. Some claim that this slogan was to give people hope who arrived at the camp, so that the people who were not murdered immediately, but simply set to work, would think that they could save themselves by working hard. I disagree. It was simply to mock the people arriving. That was the point of telling people work makes you free. It was a cruel joke. Nothing would set these poor people free. As soon as they got inside the camp, they could see what was going on. I've always looked at it as another way to crush the spirits of these people who had already been so abused. Anyway, back to the people arriving at Auschwitz-Birkenau. When they were separated, one group consisted of adults who seemed young enough and healthy enough to perform physical work. These people would be utilized as slave labor and essentially worked until they were starved to death or died of diseases, usually caused by malnutrition or the deplorable conditions. The other group was immediately sent to be murdered. Of course, they were not told that they were going to be killed. They were told that they were going to take a shower. After they removed all of their clothing, they were herded into these giant rooms that had fixtures to look like a communal shower facility. They were then locked in the airtight chamber, and a gas called Zyklon B was pumped into the room, which quickly killed everybody. The bodies were then taken out and burned. The clothing and personal possessions of the deceased were utilized for any value for the Nazi war effort. At the height of its operations, 6,000 Jews were being gassed at Auschwitz-Birkenau every single day. If you want the definition of murder on an industrial basis, this was it. Only 4 months after the Wannsee Conference, karma came for SS General Reinhard Heydrich. It was called Operation Anthropoid. It was carried out on May 27, 1942 in Prague. 2 Czech resistance operators named Josef Gabčík and Jan Kubis assassinated Reinhard Heydrich. Heydrich rode in a convertible with the top down and took the same route to work every day. The assassination was planned at a curve in the road so Heydrich's car would slow down. As the car slowed, Gabčík stepped out in front of the car with a machine gun, but the gun jammed. Kubis threw a grenade that struck the side of the car when it exploded, severely injuring Heydrich. The leader of the mass murder program, known as the Final Solution, died 8 days later on June 4, 1942. As I just outlined, the horrors of the Final Solution had been set in place in early 1942. At that point, the Frank family had been living under Nazi occupation in the Netherlands for almost 2 years. During that time, they suffered under the degrading policies instituted by the Nazis I described earlier. But the Jews in the Netherlands weren't yet being systematically murdered. In the first half of 1942, people in the Netherlands were hearing rumors of the terrors occurring in Eastern Europe. That's why Otto Frank prepared the secret annex as a hiding place for his family, and that's why they moved into the annex on July 6, 1942. What was life like for these people in hiding? It was somewhat like being in prison, but much worse. When you are a prisoner, at least in most civilized countries, you don't live in fear that the guards might come in at any moment and kill you. That is what was hanging over the heads of the 8 people in the secret annex. They were all well aware that the Gestapo might find them at any instant and either kill them on the spot or ship them off to eventual death at a concentration camp. Can you imagine living day to day with such stress? That's one of the amazing things about Anne's diary. Throughout this ordeal, she and the others tried to live as normal of a life as possible under horrific conditions. Here's a quote from Anne's diary that really demonstrates the attempt to lead normal lives, yet always being aware of the constant threats around them. This entry is from Tuesday, April 11, 1944. It reads, "My dearest Kitty, my head's in a whirl. I really don't know where to begin. Thursday, the last time I wrote you, everything was as usual. Friday afternoon, Good Friday, we played Monopoly. Saturday afternoon too. The days passed very quickly. Around 2 o'clock on Saturday, heavy firing began. Machine guns, according to the men. For the rest, everything was quiet." As I explained earlier, Anne wrote entries in her diary like they were letters to an imaginary friend named Kitty. Besides the constant threat of discovery and death, there were also other factors which made their lives harsh. They could never go outside. Anne explained how they could not get fresh air during the day. They could only open the curtains and windows at night when there were no lights on. It's you and the other 7 people in hiding with you. There's no personal space. During the day, there were people working in the building. Some of the people working at OPECTA were the helpers of the people in the secret annex. But most of the people working at OPECTA did not know about the 8 people in hiding. That meant that the people in seclusion had to be very quiet during those hours so the workers would not hear them. No talking. No unnecessary moving around which might make noise. No cooking. No using the plumbing to get a drink or use the toilet. Yes, that's right. It was like living before indoor plumbing. If you had to go to the bathroom during the day, you couldn't flush because of the noise. As Anne described in her diary, you can imagine the stench after we've each had a turn in the toilet. But Anne even found humor in such a hardship. In an entry dated Friday, February 5, 1943, she wrote about a time involving the teenage boy Peter. Here is how Anne depicted the scene with Peter. One afternoon, we couldn't use the toilet because there were visitors in the office. Unable to wait, he went to the bathroom but didn't flush the toilet. To warn us of the unpleasant odor, he tacked a sign on the door, RSVP, gas. Of course, he meant danger, gas, but he thought RSVP looked more elegant. The people of the secret annex had a radio which they could listen to only at night when there was nobody else in the building. They would listen to the BBC from London to hear the latest news broadcasts in several languages, including German, Dutch, French, and English. I think this entry from Wednesday, March 29, 1944, sums up the stress they were living under, along with the knowledge of the historic, yet horrific, times they were living under. Dearest Kitty, Mr. Bolkestein, the cabinet minister, speaking on the Dutch broadcast from London, said that after the war, a collection would be made of diaries and letters dealing with the war. Of course, everyone pounced on my diary. Just imagine how interesting it would be if I were to publish a novel about the secret annex. The title alone would make people think it was a detective story. Seriously though, 10 years after the war, people would find it very amusing to read how we lived, what we ate, and what we talked about as Jews in hiding. Although I tell you a great deal about our lives, you still know very little about us. How frightened the women are during air raids. Last Sunday, for instance, when 350 British planes dropped 550 tons of bombs on Ijmuiden so that the houses trembled like blades of grass in the wind, or how many epidemics are raging here. Throughout her diary, Anne talks about what she wanted to be when she grew up, what she wanted to do after the war. She wanted to become a journalist or a famous writer. As she explained in her Wednesday, April 5, 1944 entry, I know I can write. A few of my stories are good. My depictions of the secret annex are humorous. Much of my diary is vivid and alive, but it remains to be seen whether I really have talent. After 2 years in hiding and living in constant fear, Anne and the others were overjoyed when they heard on the radio about the D-Day landings in Normandy, France. It seemed like the end of the war was in sight. In her diary, Anne wrote on June 6, 1944, "A huge commotion in the annex. Is this really the beginning of the long-awaited liberation? The liberation we've talked so much about, which still seems too good, too much of a fairy tale ever to come true? Will this year, 1944, bring us victory? We don't know yet, but where there's hope, there's life. It fills us with fresh courage and makes us strong again. We'll need to be brave to endure the many fears and hardships and the suffering yet to come. It's now a matter of remaining calm and steadfast, of gritting our teeth and keeping a stiff upper lip. France, Russia, Italy, and even Germany can cry out in agony, but we don't yet have that right. I'm amazed that somebody who is only about to turn 15 years old could capture these emotions so well. The 8 people in the secret annex rightly assumed that the Western Allies would liberate the Netherlands soon, but no. An Allied military campaign called Operation Market Garden in September 1944 failed, and the Germans continued in control of the Netherlands. The German forces in the Netherlands did not surrender until May 1945. Sadly, that was too late for Anne and the others. Here is one of the most famous quotes from Anne Frank. She wrote this on Saturday, July 15, 1944. "It's a wonder I haven't abandoned all of my ideals. They seem so absurd and impractical, yet I cling to them because I still believe, in spite of everything, that people are truly good at heart. It's utterly impossible for me to build my life on a foundation of chaos, suffering, and death. I see the world being slowly transformed into a wilderness. I hear the approaching thunder that, one day, will destroy us too. I feel the suffering of millions, and yet, when I look up at the sky, I somehow feel that everything will change for the better, that this cruelty too shall end, that peace and tranquility will return once more. In the meantime, I must hold on to my ideals. Perhaps the day will come when I'll be able to realize them." I find that July 15 entry, one of her very last, to be heartbreaking. She was still optimistic in spite of everything. However, on August 4, 1944, Dutch police officers headed by SS Hauptschaarführer Karl Joseph Silberbauer raided the hiding place and arrested the people in hiding and 2 of their helpers. Somebody had betrayed them. We know this because when the SS and Dutch police arrived, they knew exactly where to go. They moved the bookcase, exposing the staircase, and went upstairs and arrested everybody. Ever since the diary of Anne Frank was published, people have wondered who betrayed them. In 2022, findings were released from an investigation conducted by a team headed by an ex-FBI agent, along with historians and other experts. Although they could not be certain, the team made a finding that it was probably Arnold Vandenberg, a Jewish man living in Amsterdam. It was believed that Vandenberg had been cooperating with the Nazis because Vandenberg and his family had not been sent to a concentration camp. Another reason for this conclusion is that there was an anonymous note sent to Otto Frank after the war, identifying Arnold Vandenberg as the person who betrayed the Frank family. It is assumed that Otto Frank never released that note because he was concerned that it would stir up more anti-Semitism. There are already enough people blaming the victims of the Holocaust. Why give such people an opportunity to say, see, even their own people were turning them in? That is a terrible sentiment. If Arnold Vandenberg was the person who informed on the people in the secret annex, I think it is very hard for those of us today to judge this person harshly. We all like to think we would never turn in somebody else to save ourselves or our own family. That's very easy to say when you're not facing it. It has to be unbearable to be faced with such a choice. Either you inform on somebody else or you and your family go to a concentration camp. The vast majority of us are lucky that we have never had to face such an impossible situation. I know that this is a depressing episode, so here is an uplifting story involving 2 entire countries, Denmark and Sweden. Sweden was not occupied during World War II, but sadly, Denmark was. For the first few years of German occupation, the Nazis did not act against the Jews in Denmark. It appears that the German hierarchy did not want to antagonize the local population. Of course, this was too good to last. In the fall of 1943, the Nazis prepared to round up the approximately 7,800 Jews living in Denmark. The Danes found out about this and decided to act. I just measured on Google Maps the distance across the water from Copenhagen, Denmark to Malmö, Sweden is approximately 10 miles or 16 kilometers. The distance between the two countries is even shorter in other places. The Danish underground arranged for transportation of approximately 7,200 Danish Jews across the water to Sweden and safety. Tragically, approximately 470 Jews were caught by the Nazis and sent to Theresienstadt, a ghetto labor camp. Certainly, the number of people who got rounded up and sent to such a camp is a calamity. But overall, this is a heartwarming tale of Danes from all walks of life risking their own personal safety to help their fellow countrymen. And it also speaks highly of the Swedes. They accepted these refugees. That was a brave act. By accepting these Jewish migrants, the Swedes were risking retribution from the Nazi war machine. At a time when unspeakable horrors were the norm throughout Europe, it's nice to focus on a moment when people from two countries risked severe reprisals to do the right thing and to save other people. As I told you earlier, two of the people who were helping those in the secret annex were arrested. They were Victor Kugler and Johannes Kleiman. Both were in prison, but both survived the war. The 8 people of the secret annex were not so lucky. After they were arrested, all 8 were sent by train to the Westerbroek transit camp. Herman van Pels, his wife Auguste, and their son Peter were all sent to Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration and extermination camp. That is where Herman was murdered in the gas chamber. In November 1944, Auguste van Pels was transported to a few other camps. It's unclear why they kept moving her around, but Auguste died on a transport train to Theresienstadt concentration camp in German-occupied Czechoslovakia, probably of typhus, although one Holocaust survivor said that she saw the Germans throw Auguste under the train to kill her. Like so many of the millions who were slain during the Holocaust, we'll probably never know the exact date or cause of death. Peter van Pels was in Auschwitz when the Red Army was approaching the camp in January 1945. Instead of just abandoning these poor prisoners, the Nazis took all who were able to walk. They marched approximately 60,000 people through brutal winter conditions to avoid liberation by the Allies. This always struck me as one of the worst things that the Nazis did. The Soviets were closing in from the east, and the Americans, British, and Canadians were quickly advancing from the west. It's only a matter of time before the Nazi regime collapses and Germany is completely occupied. But they kept up the murderous Nazi policies until the end. Somewhere between 9,000 and 15,000 prisoners on this forced winter march died. Peter van Pels survived the forced trek all the way to Mauthausen concentration camp. That camp was liberated on May 5, 1945 by the American Army. Sadly, Peter died 5 days later on May 10 from an unknown illness due to the harsh living conditions and forced labor. He was only 18 years old. Fritz Pfeffer ended up at Neuengamme concentration camp in northern Germany. He died there on December 20, 1944 of a gastrointestinal infection. Anne Frank, her sister Margot, and her mother Edith were first sent to Westerbroek and later Auschwitz-Birkenau. Edith died of an unknown illness on January 6, 1945. That was only 3 weeks before Auschwitz-Birkenau was liberated by the Allies. For a while, Edith was with both of her daughters at that camp. But on November 1, 1944, Edith remained behind when Margot and Anne were transported to Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. We don't have the exact dates, but both Margot and Anne died in February 1945 of spotted typhus. We are not sure, but we believe that Anne outlived her sister by a day or two. Since we don't know the exact date of her death, we're not sure whether Margot was 18 or had just turned 19, since her birthday was February 16, 1926. We do know that Anne was only 15 years old when she died. Otto Frank was the only one of the 8 people from the secret annex who survived the Holocaust. When Peter was sent on that winter march I told you about earlier, Otto remained in Auschwitz because he was too sick to walk. Otto was still at Auschwitz when the camp was liberated by the Red Army on January 27, 1945. He weighed only 115 pounds or 52 kilograms. On June 3, 1945, Otto made it back to Amsterdam. As was the case with so many Holocaust survivors, Otto no longer had a home. It was occupied by other people. So Otto moved in with Jan and Miep Geis. After the arrests of the 8 people in hiding, Miep Geist went through the items remaining in the secret annex. She found Anne's diary and saved it. She had hoped to return it to Anne after the war. But when she and Otto learned that Anne had died, Miep gave the diary to Otto. Can you imagine what it had to be like for Otto to read that? You lost your whole family, but here were the thoughts of one of your children preserved in a diary. After reading it, Otto realized that this was a tragic treasure which should be shared with the world. It took him a while, but eventually he convinced publishers to print it. In some countries, the book was titled The Secret Annex. In the U.S., it was titled Anne Frank, The Diary of a Young Girl. More than 30 million copies have been sold worldwide, and it has been translated into over 70 languages. This makes Anne Frank's diary one of the best-selling memoirs of all time. That's it for today. If you're listening on a podcast app which allows ratings, I would greatly appreciate a 5-star rating. Reviews really help. Spotify allows reviews of a particular episode, so of course I would appreciate any kind words in a review of this episode. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, it's easy to leave a review for my entire podcast. Scroll down the History Analyzed show page, select a rating, and then tap Write a Review. Please subscribe to this podcast. Please like this and my other episodes. Please tell your friends, relatives, co-workers. Word of mouth is the best way to increase the audience for History Analyzed. Check out my website, historyanalyzed.com, where you will find links to fun items for all the history geeks out there. Thank you for listening. Catch you next episode.